I'm Sarah, 52 now, but this story takes place when I was 25. It's about how my vindictive ex-husband's attempt to have me jailed during our divorce backfired spectacularly. Sometimes the sweetest revenge comes wrapped in a box of carefully curated junk. I met James at one of my first real estate showings. I was fresh out of college, proud owner of my newly acquired real estate license, and desperate to make my first sale. He walked in wearing an expensive suit that I'd later learn was his only one, flashing a smile that could charm a rattlesnake. Looking back, I should have noticed how his eyes lingered too long on the house's price tag rather than its features. "This is exactly what I've been looking for," he said, even before I'd finished my rehearsed speech about the hardwood floors. I was too excited about potentially closing my first sale to notice the red flag. Spoiler alert, he never made an offer, but he did ask me to dinner. Within 6 months, I was showing him a different house, mine. I'd bought it right before meeting him, scraping together every penny from 3 years of waitressing through college and a generous loan from my parents. It wasn't much, but it was mine. All mine. The pride of ownership meant everything to a small-town girl whose family had always rented. James moved in after our wedding, bringing with him what seemed like barely enough possessions to fill a studio apartment. "I believe in minimalism," he'd explained, which I found refreshingly mature. Another red flag I missed. He was minimalist because he'd gambled away most of his possessions, but I wouldn't learn that until much later. The first year was good, or at least I convinced myself it was. James had a way of making everything seem fine even when it wasn't, like when bills mysteriously went unpaid despite him promising to handle them, or when my jewelry started disappearing, only to reappear days later in places I swore I hadn't left them. He always had an explanation, and I always wanted to believe him. It was my best friend Jenny who first noticed something was off. "Have you seen how he looks at you when you're talking about your commission checks?" she asked one day over coffee. "It's like a kid eyeing the last cookie in the jar." I brushed her off, but her words stuck with me. I started paying more attention. The way he'd casually ask about my upcoming closings. How he always seemed to have a reason why we should pool our money into his account. The late-night phone calls he'd take in the garage, speaking in hushed tones about sure things and guaranteed returns. Everything came to a head when I discovered our joint savings account had been drained. All $15,000 gone. When I confronted him, his transformation was instant. The charming smile vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating I'd never seen before. He claimed he'd invested it in a can't-miss opportunity. When I pressed for details, he exploded, accusing me of never supporting his dreams. That night, as I lay awake listening to him snore beside me, I made my decision. The next morning, I called a divorce attorney before heading to work. I didn't know it then, but that phone call would set in motion a chain of events that would test my patience, drain my bank account, and ultimately lead to one of the most satisfying moments of my life. James took the divorce news exactly as well as you'd expect from someone who'd just lost their meal ticket. He moved out without much fuss, but that was just the calm before the storm. I changed the locks the same day, a decision that would prove both wise and ultimately futile. Because what James lacked in financial responsibility, he made up for in pure, concentrated spite. I came home from work one evening to find my front door slightly ajar. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was terribly wrong. The air felt different, disturbed. There was a faint smell of his cologne, the expensive kind I used to buy him for special occasions. As I moved through the house, the damage revealed itself slowly, like a horror movie in slow motion. My clothes, my jewelry, my family photos, anything that meant something to me had been methodically destroyed. Standing in my bedroom, surrounded by the wreckage of my personal life, I felt something shift inside me. The fear and sadness were still there, but above them rose something else, pure, righteous anger. I called the police, of course. They came, took pictures, wrote their report, and gave me that look I'd become all too familiar with over the following months. Sympathy mixed with helplessness. "Ma'am, unless you have proof it was him." I knew how that sentence ended. The officer suggested I install security cameras. "Great idea," I said. "I'll get right on that with all the money I don't have since my soon-to-be ex drained our accounts." The younger cop actually cracked a smile at that. His partner shot him a look that could have frozen hell. Jenny and Maria showed up within an hour of my tearful phone call, armed with wine, pizza, and the kind of righteous anger only best friends can provide. As we sorted through the wreckage of my closet, Maria held up my favorite dress, now more holes than fabric. "You know what this reminds me of?" Jenny said, examining a particularly vindictive slash in the dress's bodice. "Remember that time in college when Todd Williams keyed Maria's car because she wouldn't go out with him, and how we got him back?" I managed a weak laugh. "You mean when we posted his phone number on every campus bulletin board advertising free Jets tickets?" The memory actually made me smile. God, his phone rang for weeks. "The point is," Maria chimed in, carefully folding what remained of my clothes, Men like James and Todd, they only understand consequences when they hurt in return, but revenge would have to wait. The next few weeks became a blur of attorney meetings and court appearances. James contested everything, even things that weren't contestable. The house was mine, bought before marriage with documented proof of where every penny came from. Yet there he was, claiming he'd contributed significantly to the property's value. His contribution? Mowing the lawn twice and installing a ceiling fan that never worked properly. My attorney, Sarah, yes, we shared a name, was a godsend. She'd seen it all before and knew exactly how to handle each of James's increasingly desperate attempts to claim what wasn't his. He's fishing, she explained one afternoon, reviewing yet another ridiculous filing from his lawyer. Men like him, when they realize they're losing control, they try to create chaos. It's about power, not property. She was right, but knowing that didn't make it any easier when James's next move blindsided us all. It came in the form of a seemingly innocent court filing, a request for the return of personal property. Standard procedure in divorces, usually. Just a formality to ensure both parties get their rightful belongings. Except this wasn't standard at all. When Sarah handed me the list in her office, I actually laughed at first. 2 pages, single-spaced, of items James claimed he'd brought into the marriage. Items I'd allegedly refused to return. The longer I read, the more my laugh turned into something between a sob and a scream. A computer? He'd never owned one. He used to use mine to search for sports betting odds. A gun? The closest thing to a weapon he'd ever possessed was the knife set I'd bought him for Christmas that one year. Expensive clothing? The man wore the same 5 shirts on rotation. It went on, each item more fabricated than the last. But here's where it got really nasty. At the bottom of the filing, his attorney had included a motion for contempt of court if I failed to return these items. The penalty? Either pay $2,000 in replacement costs or face jail time. He can't do this, I said, my voice shaking. These things don't even exist. Sarah's face was grim. He can, and he is. The burden of proof in these situations, she trailed off, shuffling through more papers. We can fight it, but that means more court dates, more attorney fees. And judges, well, they don't look kindly on parties who appear to be withholding property. I stared at the list again, feeling the walls closing in. $2,000 might as well have been $2 million at that point. James had made sure of that when he emptied our accounts. The other option, jail, would mean losing my job, my real estate license, everything I'd worked for. That night, alone in my vandalized house, I pulled out the list again. Reading through it for the 10th time, something started nagging at the back of my mind. James had always been meticulous about details when it came to money or possessions. The time he'd loaned his watch to a coworker, he'd written up a whole agreement including the exact model number and current market value. Yet this list was strangely vague. Just gun, not Smith & Wesson Model 59. Just computer, not IBM PS2 Model 30. Just camping gear, not the exhaustive inventory I would have expected from him. That vagueness kept gnawing at me. James, the man who once spent 3 hours documenting every scratch on a rental car, had suddenly become remarkably unconcerned with details. Something wasn't adding up. I called Jenny at nearly midnight, not even caring about the hour. She answered on the first ring. That's the kind of friend she is. The list, I said without preamble. I need you to look at it. I'll be there in 15 minutes, she replied. I heard her already grabbing her keys. She showed up in her pajamas, clutching a bottle of wine and wearing the determined expression I remembered from our college study sessions. We spread the list out on my kitchen table, one of the few pieces of furniture James hadn't managed to damage during his break-in rampage. Read it to me, Jenny said, uncorking the wine. Slowly, I started going through each item. With every vague description, Jenny's smile grew wider. By the time I finished, she was practically bouncing in her chair. Sarah, she said, reaching across the table to grab my hand. Don't you see? He screwed up. He screwed up big time. I just stared at her. Look, she continued, pointing at the list. Gun. What kind of gun? Computer? What brand? What year? Camping gear? What specifically? He's left everything so vague that technically anything could satisfy these descriptions. Her eyes were sparkling now. A toy gun is still a gun. A computer from 1982 is still a computer. A single tent stake could be considered camping gear. I felt my jaw drop as the implications started sinking in. Jenny, are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we give him exactly what he asked for. Every single item on this list, just maybe not quite in the condition he's imagining. The more we talked about it, the more perfect it seemed. The law would be satisfied. I would be returning items matching every description on his list. The judge couldn't fault me for that. And James? Well, James would learn a valuable lesson about being careful what you wish for. We stayed up until 3 a.m. making our own list. A shopping list of the worst possible versions of everything James had claimed. Jenny had connections at several local thrift stores from her volunteer work, and I knew a few pawn shop owners from my real estate dealings. This could actually work. But first, I needed to deal with the more immediate problem, James's increasingly bold attempts to intimidate me. The break-in had just been the start. He'd begun showing up at my open houses, pretending to be an interested buyer, then leaving without a word. My neighbors reported seeing his car parked outside my house at odd hours. One morning, I found my mailbox stuffed with all my old love letters to him, each one torn to shreds. I finally took the police officer's advice and installed security cameras. Maria's brother did the installation at cost, bless him. I started documenting everything. Every drive-by, every coincidental run-in at the grocery store, every hang-up call in the middle of the night. The cameras proved their worth just 3 days after installation. They caught James trying to break in again at 2 a.m., this time through the back door. The footage wasn't great. Grainy security cameras in 1990 weren't exactly HD quality, but it was clear enough to show someone matching his build, wearing his distinctive leather jacket, attempting to pick the lock. When I brought the tape to my attorney, Sarah's eyes lit up. "This is good," she said, rewinding to watch it again. "Really good. We can use this to prove he did the first break-in." "Better," she replied. "We can use it as leverage. A little insurance policy, let's say, just in case he decides to make any fuss about whatever items you end up returning to him." I caught her slight smirk and realized she'd figured out what Jenny and I were planning. She didn't say anything explicit, plausible deniability and all that, but she did pull out a legal pad and start writing. "So, hypothetically speaking," she said, "if someone were to need to document the return of various items to satisfy a court order, they might want to be very thorough in their photographic and video evidence. Every item should be clearly visible, clearly matching the descriptions provided in the original list." I left her office that day with a detailed checklist of how to document everything we were about to do. But first, Jenny and I had some shopping to do, very specific shopping. The next morning, Jenny arrived at my house with a stack of newspapers and her trusty highlighter. "Research," she announced, spreading them across my kitchen table. She'd circled every yard sale and estate sale listing in a 50-mile radius. Maria joined us an hour later, bringing coffee and donuts. "I called in sick to work," she said, grinning. "This is way more important than teaching third graders about fractions today." We divided James's list into categories: electronics, sporting goods, furniture, and what we started calling the miscellaneous mayhem section. The computer would be our biggest challenge. Even a terrible one would cost more than we wanted to spend. But Jenny had an idea about that. "My brother Pete works in office clearance," she said, taking a bite of her donut. "They've got a warehouse full of ancient machines companies don't want anymore. Most are headed for the scrap heap." I raised an eyebrow. "Define ancient, like possibly older than you. Green screen, runs DOS if you're lucky. Probably weighs more than your car." "Perfect." We spent that morning making calls. Jenny sweet-talked her brother into letting us browse the warehouse. Maria's cousin worked at a pawn shop downtown and promised to keep an eye out for particularly terrible items. That might suit our needs. Even my normally straight-laced real estate colleague Susan got in on the act, mentioning that her husband's garage was full of rusty treasures we might be interested in. The list sat between us, coffee stains already marking its corners. 2 pages of James's attempted power play that we were about to turn into his worst nightmare. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the sight of my shredded clothes, my destroyed photos, the violation of my home. The anger that rose in my throat tasted like justice. Our first stop was Pete's warehouse. The place was huge, dim, and smelled like old electronics and dust. Pete met us at the loading dock, keys jangling. "Jenny said you're looking for the worst computer we've got?" he asked, leading us through narrow aisles of defunct office equipment. "The absolute worst," I confirmed, "as long as it technically qualifies as a computer." He grinned. "Oh, do I have something for you?" The machine he showed us was perfect. An IBM from the early 80s, complete with a cracked monitor that flickered ominously when powered on. The keyboard was missing half its keys, and the whole thing made a sound like a dying vacuum cleaner. "Does it work?" I asked. Pete shrugged. "Define work." "It turns on. Sometimes, if you hit it just right and say a prayer." "How much?" "For Jenny's friend? $20. And I'll throw in these broken printers for free." From there, we hit every thrift store in a 30-mile radius. The employees quickly got into the spirit of our quest once we explained the situation. At Goodwill, a clerk named Marge spent an hour digging through their back room to find the most tragic camping equipment she could locate. "This tent," she said, holding up something that might have once been green, "has been here since I started working here 5 years ago. Pretty sure it's got more holes than fabric at this point." The gun was trickier. We had to make absolutely sure we stayed within legal bounds. But in a stroke of luck, Maria found a rusty cap gun at a yard sale, complete with a broken trigger, and paint so faded you could barely tell it had once been silver. "The best part," she said, turning it over in her hands, is that it still technically counts as a gun, just not the kind he's thinking of. Each find felt like a small victory. The more ridiculous the item, the more perfect it was for our purpose. A fishing rod that was more splinters than rod. A set of golf clubs that looked like they'd been used to dig trenches. And when we found a Monopoly board with nothing but the beaten-up board itself, no pieces, no cards, not even the box, I actually cried from laughing so hard, but the real masterpiece came from an unexpected source. Among the items on James's list was a decorative bust, something he'd definitely never owned. We were planning to hit some antique stores to look for a damaged one when Jenny had a better idea. "Remember that ceramics class I took last summer?" she asked, a mischievous glint in her eye. "I still have access to the studio, and I make a mean, ugly sculpture." The ceramics studio was in the basement of the community center, all concrete floors and fluorescent lighting. Jenny hadn't been kidding about her skills. Her previous works lined the shelves, each one actually quite beautiful, which made what we were about to do even better. "The key," Jenny explained, rolling up her sleeves and grabbing a lump of clay, "is to make it look intentionally bad while still being technically skilled enough to pass as a real piece of art." She winked at me. "Trust me, I had plenty of practice making deliberately awful pieces when I was learning." For the next 3 hours, we watched Jenny work. The bust slowly took shape under her hands, becoming a masterpiece of calculated awfulness. The eyes were slightly uneven, the nose just a bit too large, the mouth set in what could either be a smirk or a grimace, depending on how you looked at it. The overall effect was unsettling in the best possible way. "It kind of looks like him," Maria observed, tilting her head to one side. "If he got stung by bees and then sat in the sun too long." Jenny added one final touch, a tiny signature and date on the bottom, carefully aged to look like it had been there for years. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her work. One vintage decorative bust, ready for its new home. While the bust was firing in the kiln, we continued our scavenger hunt. The list had specified professional attire, so we hit every thrift store in town looking for the most spectacularly dated suits we could find. We found a powder blue polyester nightmare that looked like it had escaped from a 1970s prom, complete with mysterious stains and a tear in exactly the wrong place. "Oh God," I laughed, holding it up. "Remember when he wore that one designer suit to every showing I did? Acted like he was some big-shot real estate investor? The one he had to return to the store after a week because his credit card bounced?" Maria snorted. Classic James. Each item we found was better, worse than the last. The valuable book collection he'd claimed? We found a complete set of water-damaged romance novels from the library's discard pile, complete with pages stuck together and covers so faded you could barely read the titles. The antique pocket watch became a plastic Disney watch with Mickey's hands falling off. The professional camera equipment transformed into a disposable camera, with half the pictures already taken, mostly of someone's thumb. But my personal favorite was when we tackled the home gym equipment entry on his list. James had never owned so much as a dumbbell in his life, but he'd claimed an entire home gym setup. We found a single rusty hand grip exerciser, its spring so weak it barely moved, and a jump rope that was more electrical tape than rope. "You know what makes this even better?" Jenny said as we added them to our growing collection. "He can't even complain about any of this without admitting he lied about owning it all in the first place." The more items we gathered, the more I started feeling something I hadn't felt since this whole divorce nightmare began. Power. Not the cruel kind of power James had tried to hold over me, but something different. The power of turning his weapons against him, of finding humor in the darkness he'd tried to create. We kept meticulous records of everything, just as my attorney had suggested. Maria filmed while Jenny photographed each item in detail, making sure to document how each one matched the descriptions in James's list exactly. We even started a spreadsheet tracking where we'd found each item and how much we'd paid. The total was staying well under the $200 mark, a far cry from the $2,000 he'd tried to extort from me. The bust came out of the kiln looking even more perfectly terrible than we'd hoped. Jenny had somehow managed to make the glaze bubble in just the right places, giving it a texture that made you want to look away but couldn't quite manage to. "It's hideous," I said, staring at it in wonder. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." We were running out of items on the list, but we saved what we knew would be the best for last. James had claimed ownership of a valuable collection of rare coins. None of us could wait to tackle that one, especially after Maria's grandfather, a retired bank teller, heard about our project and offered his expertise. "Oh, honey," he'd said over the phone, chuckling, "you leave the coins to me. I've got some real special ones saved up from over the years." Maria's grandfather met us at his house the next day. George was in his 70s, with thick glasses and hands that shook slightly, but his eyes sparkled with mischief as he led us to his basement. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, each labeled meticulously with dates and categories. 43 years at First National, he said, pulling out a drawer. "You wouldn't believe the things people tried to pass off as legal tender." He started laying out coins on a felt cloth, Canadian pennies, arcade tokens, Foreign currency so old the countries don't even exist anymore. He'd saved them all, apparently. Each one came with a story. The Chuck E. Cheese token someone tried to use as a quarter. The Mexican peso from 1943 that had been painted silver. The Chinese coin with the square hole in the middle that someone had insisted was a rare American experimental piece. Now this, he said, holding up what looked like a silver dollar, this is special. Guy tried to use it to pay his mortgage in '82. It's actually aluminum, painted to look like silver, probably came from a magic shop. By the time we left, we had a shoebox full of worthless coins that technically qualified as a collection, and enough stories to fill a book. George refused to take any money for them. Just promise me you'll take pictures of everything, he said, walking us to the door. I want to add this story to my collection. The final piece of our plan came together at what we'd started calling our war room, my kitchen table, now permanently covered in lists, receipts, and Polaroid photos of our finds. We were going through everything one last time when Jenny suddenly sat up straight. Wait, she said, grabbing James's list. Look at this. He claims there's a valuable antique desk that's been in his family for generations. Maria and I exchanged glances. He never had anything like that, I said. His mom gave him a folding card table when we got married, but that's it. Exactly, Jenny grinned. But the list just says antique desk. It doesn't specify what kind of antique or what makes it valuable. That's how we found ourselves at a local flea market the next day, explaining our situation to Stan, a retired carpenter who had a booth full of what he called rescued furniture. Rescued is a generous term, he admitted, leading us through rows of battered pieces. Most of this stuff was headed for the dump before I got my hands on it. The desk he showed us was perfect. It had probably been beautiful once, around 1920 or so. Now it was missing 2 drawers, had at least 3 different colors of paint visible through the chips and scratches, and made an ominous creaking sound if you touched it. The previous owner's cat used it as a scratching post, Stan explained, pointing to the deep gouges in the legs. And I think someone tried to fix this drawer with duct tape at some point. How much? I asked, already in love with its awfulness. Stan looked at the desk, then at us, then back at the desk. You know what? Take it. I've been trying to get rid of it for months. My wife says it's taking up too much space in our garage. The real challenge was getting it home. We ended up having to rent a small truck, and even then it was touch and go. The desk seemed to be held together mostly by spite and old varnish. Every bump in the road made us hold our breath, afraid it would finally give up and collapse into a pile of splinters, but it made it, barely. We set it up in my garage next to our other finds and stepped back to admire our collection. It was magnificent in its awfulness. Every single item precisely matched the descriptions in James's list, while being simultaneously the worst possible version of that item. The computer that might have witnessed the birth of DOS, the gun that couldn't shoot anything more dangerous than a cork, the professional camera equipment that had probably captured someone's birthday party in 1989, the valuable coin collection that wouldn't buy a cup of coffee, the antique desk that looked like it had survived several wars and lost all of them, and presiding over it all, Jenny's masterpiece, the bust that seemed to judge you no matter where you stood, its uneven eyes following you around the room, its smirk grimace promising nightmares to come. We need to document everything, Maria said, pulling out her video camera. Like Sarah's lawyer said, everything needs to be recorded. She was right. We needed proof that each item existed and matched the descriptions exactly. But more than that, we needed to preserve this moment, this beautiful, perfect moment of justice about to be served. The sun was setting as we started setting up the lights and camera. Through the garage window, I could see my house. My house, not his, silhouetted against the orange sky. The house he'd tried to claim, the home he'd violated, the space he'd tried to take from me. Setting up for the documentation was like preparing for a bizarre art gallery opening. We arranged everything carefully in my garage, making sure each item was clearly visible and identifiable. Maria's experience filming school plays came in handy as she directed the lighting, 2 shop lamps and a bunch of clip-on desk lights we'd borrowed from various offices. We need to be methodical about this, Jenny said, clipboard in hand. Each item needs to be shown clearly, matching exactly what's written on his list. No room for arguments or confusion. We decided to film it like one of my real estate walkthroughs. I would present each item, reading directly from James's list, then showing how our found item matched his description perfectly. Jenny would take photographs while Maria handled the video camera. Item 1, I said, trying to keep my voice professional despite the ridiculousness of it all. 1 professional-grade computer system with monitor. I gestured to the ancient IBM like a game. Show hostess? As you can see, this is indeed a computer system, complete with monitor. The fact that it predates the Reagan administration is irrelevant to the description provided. We went through each item this way, maintaining straight faces through sheer force of will. The valuable coin collection got special attention. We arranged George's contributions carefully on black velvet, filming each rare piece individually. The Chuck E. Cheese token got its own glamour shot. The bust was particularly challenging to film with a straight face. Jenny had positioned it so the light caught every deliberately awful angle. Note the artistic interpretation, I managed to say, only cracking slightly. The emotional depth conveyed through the slightly crossed eyes. Maria lost it at that point and had to restart the take 3 times. But the real challenge came with the desk. We'd saved it for last, knowing it would be the most difficult to document without breaking character. Stan's rescue looked even worse under our lighting setup. The duct tape repair job gleamed like a badge of honor. As specified in the list, I said, running my hand along its scarred surface. This is indeed an antique desk. It's unique patina and battle scars only add to its historical significance. Just then, one of the remaining drawers chose that moment to give up its long fight against gravity and clattered to the floor. We kept it in the final cut. It felt appropriate somehow. The whole documentation process took hours. We had to restart several times when someone would break into giggles or when we'd think of an even better way to present something. By the time we finished, it was nearly midnight. Now for the paperwork, Jenny said, pulling out the forms my attorney had prepared. We needed to document everything in writing, too, a detailed inventory matching each item to James's list, with photographs attached and notes about condition, though we charitably described everything as used or vintage, rather than catastrophically damaged or possibly radioactive. Maria's teacher organization skills proved invaluable here. She created a cross-referenced system that would have impressed a library scientist. Each item was numbered, photographed, and logged with military precision. If he tries to claim anything wasn't what he asked for, she said, triple-checking her work, he'll have to argue with this documentation. And good luck with that. The final touch was my statement for the court. My attorney had helped me draft it, walking a perfect line between malicious compliance and plausible deniability. Upon careful review of Mr. James's last name's list of claimed property, I have made every effort to locate and return items, matching his descriptions. Each item has been documented and verified to match the specifications provided in his filing. While some items may show signs of age or wear, they all meet the criteria as written in his submitted list. We made 3 copies of everything, one for the court, one for James's attorney, and one for our records. The originals went into a fireproof safe Jenny's dad let us borrow. Just in case, she said, locking it with a satisfying click. Looking at our work spread out across the garage, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride in what we'd accomplished. Satisfaction at the thought of James's reaction, but also something else, a sense of closure maybe. We'd turned his attempt to hurt me into something else entirely, something that made me laugh instead of cry. The court date was set for Monday morning. Everything was ready. All that was left was to deliver our masterpiece to the courthouse and watch justice, poetic, hilarious justice, take its course. As we packed up the cameras and lights, Jenny picked up the bust one last time. You know, she said, turning it to catch the light just right. I think this might be my finest work. The bust's crooked smirk seemed to agree. Monday morning arrived with the kind of perfect clarity you usually only see in movies. Jenny and Maria showed up at my house at 7 a.m. sharp, dressed in their most professional outfits. We had all agreed to treat this like the premiere it was. The court clerk's face when we rolled in with our carefully packed boxes was priceless. James's attorney arrived first, his usual smug expression faltering slightly at the sight of our documentation binder. It was 3 inches thick and color-coded, thanks to Maria's organizational skills. James walked in last, wearing his one good suit and that familiar look of calculated confidence. He barely glanced at me, but I caught his double take when he saw the boxes. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. My attorney presented everything to the judge with the kind of professional gravity usually reserved for major criminal evidence. Your Honor, my client has gone to extraordinary lengths to comply with Mr. James's last name's request for the return of his claimed property. We have detailed documentation of each item. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd seen it all, raised an eyebrow at the thickness of the binder. She began flipping through it, her expression shifting from mild annoyance to barely concealed amusement as she reviewed our photographs and descriptions. I see, she said, pausing at what I'm pretty sure was the photo of the bust. And all these items match the descriptions provided by the plaintiff? Exactly as written, Your Honor, my attorney confirmed. We have video documentation as well, if the court requires it. James's attorney was starting to look distinctly uncomfortable. He leaned over to whisper something to James, whose face was turning an interesting shade of red. The judge continued through the binder, actually coughing to cover what I'm certain was a laugh when she got to the Monopoly board documentation. Well, she said finally, it appears Mrs. my last name has been quite thorough in complying with the court's order. Your Honor, James's attorney started, but she held up a hand. The items requested have been provided. matching the descriptions given to this court. Unless your client wishes to amend his statement about the ownership of these specific items, she fixed James with a look that could have frozen hell. The beauty of it was, he couldn't. He couldn't claim these weren't the items he'd asked for without admitting he'd lied about owning them in the first place. He couldn't argue about the condition without providing proof of what they should have looked like. He was trapped by his own vague descriptions and false claims. "No, Your Honor," his attorney said stiffly. "Then this matter is resolved. The items will be transferred to Mr. James's last name's possession via his attorney's office. Furthermore," she shuffled some papers, then looked directly at James. "Given the security camera footage submitted last week, this court takes a very dim view of attempted break-ins and harassment. Consider this a formal warning." James looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. His attorney just looked like he wanted to retire. The boxes were delivered to his attorney's office that afternoon. I never saw James's face when he opened them, but his attorney's secretary later told Jenny's cousin that the string of profanity was impressive enough to teach sailors some new vocabulary. That evening, Jenny, Maria, and I celebrated with champagne in my backyard, the same backyard where James had once talked about his big plans, his sure-thing investments, his dreams of wealth that always seemed to require my money to achieve. "To justice," Jenny toasted, served with a side of perfectly legal petty revenge. "To friends," Maria added, "who help you shop for the world's worst antiques." "To freedom," I said, looking at my house. My house, free and clear. "And to never letting anyone make you feel powerless." The divorce was finalized a week later. James never contested anything else, and the security cameras caught no more late-night visits. I heard through the grapevine that he'd moved to another state, probably to find new people to scam. That was 30 years ago. The house is still mine, though it's filled with much better memories now. Jenny went on to become a successful artist, though she never again created anything quite as magnificently terrible as that bust. Maria still teaches, and her students love hearing the story of the Great Divorce Revenge. Edited for age appropriateness, of course. And you know what? Every time I drive past a thrift store or yard sale, I still smile, remembering our scavenger hunt for justice. Because sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't the ones you can list in a court document. They're the memories you make while plotting the perfect petty revenge with your best friends.